She said it at a fundraiser, not to me, but close enough that I heard it over the clink of glasses. Touch is earned, not owed. She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile that's meant to look professional but lands like a verdict. The investor laughed. People around them nodded like it was wisdom, not a warning. I stood 2 steps behind her, holding a coat I hadn't been asked to carry, watching my wife become someone I wasn't invited to meet anymore. The room smelled like money and antiseptic. A private wing opening for a medical network that liked to brand itself as humane. I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift on the ambulance, my hands still carrying the memory of pressure on a chest that wouldn't rise. She had changed outfits between meetings, silk replacing wool, heels replacing flats. She moved through the room like she belonged to it. I moved like staff. She didn't introduce me as her husband. She introduced me as a doctor. Not my name, not our years, just a title, clipped and useful. The investor's eyes flicked over me, already done. He leaned in closer to her, close enough that I noticed the pause she allowed. A fraction of a second too long. The kind of pause you learn to count when you work emergency medicine. The kind that tells you something is about to change. They had a history, I realized then. Not an affair you catch with lipstick or hotel keys. This was cleaner. Dinners labeled work. Late calls framed as strategy. Separate entrances at events so she could arrive alone and leave surrounded. Status instead of skin. Access instead of love. I watched her hand rest on his sleeve when she laughed. Not intimate. Intentional. The investor spoke about expansion, about influence, about how relationships were leverage. She listened like a lawyer who already knew the outcome. When she turned back to me, her eyes passed through, not over. I wasn't excluded. I was irrelevant. Later, in the car, she talked about the night as a win. About visibility. About positioning. She said the investor respected boundaries. She said this was how power worked. She didn't ask how my shift went. She didn't notice I hadn't responded to her sentence about touch. At home, she went to shower, phone lighting up with a name she didn't hide. I stood in the kitchen, still in my boots, and felt something settle. Not anger. Not grief. A decision forming quietly, like paperwork sliding into place. She had turned closeness into currency. I understood currencies. I dealt in access too. I didn't confront her. I didn't raise my voice. I opened my laptop and began returning what she thought she deserved, one permission at a time. The first sign didn't come from her phone. It came from my supervisor, a man who measured time in minutes and lives. He asked why my emergency contact had been updated twice in 1 week. He didn't accuse. He just flagged it, the way professionals do when something doesn't align. I told him it was probably a system error. He nodded, already moving on. Systems fail all the time. People pretend they don't. At the station, a nurse I'd known for years asked if my wife was still handling the insurance negotiations for the new network. She said it casually, while restocking gloves. She said the investor had been calling the legal department directly, asking for her by first name. Not rude. Familiar. I felt the pause between her words. The one she didn't fill. That afternoon, my wife texted that she'd be late. No explanation. Just late. I watched the message appear and disappear on the lock screen while I cleaned blood from the ambulance floor. When you work emergencies, you learn to read absence. What isn't said? What doesn't need to be? At home, the fridge was stocked by delivery, not her. A small detail. She liked choosing things herself. Control was her language. The mail included an invitation addressed only to her. Private dinner. No +1. I placed it back where I found it, exactly aligned with the edge of the counter. That night, she came in quiet. Not tired. Focused. She talked about negotiations, about pressure, about how the investor respected competence. She said he trusted her. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her phone vibrated once on the table. She flipped it face down without breaking her sentence. I didn't ask who it was. I watched the way she held her fork, the way her shoulders stayed squared like she was still in a meeting. She wasn't hiding anything. She was managing it. Later, I saw the calendar she'd left open on her tablet. Dinners marked as calls. Calls marked as conferences. Conferences marked as travel. A pattern, clean and defensible. The kind of structure lawyers build when they want plausible distance. I closed the tablet and turned off the lights she'd left on. In the dark, I felt the second shift begin. Not the kind that ends with sirens. The kind that ends with silence. I didn't need proof yet. I needed alignment. She was building leverage with access. I was about to understand exactly where mine still existed. The proof didn't arrive dramatically. It accumulated the way fatigue does, quietly, until it changes how you stand. I noticed it in timestamps first. Her calls started ending after midnight, but her mornings didn't show it. No exhaustion, no lag, just precision. Whatever she was doing, it was giving her energy. I logged into our shared cloud account to pull a medical document I needed for credentialing. The folder structure had shifted. Subtle. New labels. A separate workspace tagged with the medical network's name. I wasn't blocked. I was simply not included. That was her style. Exclusion without confrontation. Inside were calendars synced across devices. Dinners placed where depositions should be. Travel time that didn't match flight durations. Private meeting rooms booked under the network's umbrella, billed as consultations. Clean. Legal. Defensible. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't forward files. I memorized patterns. In my line of work, you don't panic at the first abnormal reading. You observe the trend. At the station, a colleague mentioned the investor again. He'd toured the ER that morning with administration. He asked specific questions, not about patient outcomes, about throughput, branding, who controlled which decisions. He knew my name before anyone introduced us. He didn't acknowledge me when we passed. He was already past me. That evening, my wife came home carrying nothing. No bag, no coat, just her phone and that calm she wore when she felt untouchable. She kissed my cheek like a habit, not a gesture. Her phone lit up again. She glanced at it and smiled without meaning to. Later, I checked the bank app for a routine transfer. A new line item caught my eye. A corporate reimbursement routed through her account. Marked professional development. The amount was small enough to ignore if you weren't looking. Large enough to mean access had been rewarded. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask for clarity. I ran a credit report instead. Everything was joint. Everything was exposed. I saw how much of my life had been built on assumed permanence. I also saw how quickly that permanence could be revised. Before bed, I watched her set her alarm earlier than usual. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She was moving ahead of me, confident I would follow or stay still. I lay awake listening to the house breathe, mapping exits I'd never needed before. By morning, I wasn't hurt. I was oriented. She had turned proximity into a transaction. I had allowed it by staying predictable. That was over. I began preparing the kind of response that doesn't announce itself until access is already gone. I didn't leave all at once. That would have felt emotional. I left the way systems change, one permission at a time, quietly enough that no alarm goes off until the door's no longer open. On Monday, I opened a new account during my lunch break. Same bank, different branch. I rerouted my paycheck and set alerts for any movement tied to my name. By Tuesday, I updated my insurance information at the hospital, listing a new address that wasn't finished yet but already existed on paper. Paper was all I needed. On Wednesday, I changed beneficiaries. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. The forms were approved in less than an hour. At home, nothing looked different. I still washed my mug, still locked the door behind us. She still talked about meetings and timelines, about how the investor was pushing for faster integration. She said he trusted her judgment. She said it like a compliment. I nodded when required and stayed silent when it mattered. Thursday night, I packed a bag she wouldn't notice missing. Scrubs. Documents. The watch my father gave me. I left everything else where it belonged. Familiarity is camouflage. I slept beside her, listening to her breathe evenly, confident in the structure she thought she controlled. Friday morning, I left before she woke up. I didn't text. I didn't leave a note. I drove to a short-term rental near the hospital, one I'd booked under my initials weeks earlier. By the time she stood in the kitchen, the systems had already adjusted to my absence. Her first call came mid-morning. I let it ring. The second came an hour later. I was in triage, gloves on, hands steady. I didn't check the voicemail. I didn't need to. Panic has a sound, even when it's restrained. By evening, she noticed the first friction. Her card declined at a cafe near her office. A pause. An embarrassed laugh. She tried again. Same result. Later, she logged into the banking app and saw a notification she didn't recognize. Account removed. No explanation. Just fact. That night, I watched her from across a room she didn't know I was in, through a social post she hadn't meant for me to see. The investor stood beside her, smiling like stability. She smiled too, but something in her posture had shifted. Control relies on invisible systems. I had removed myself from them, and the quiet was already starting to spread. By Monday, the ripple reached the investor. Not through me. Through systems he assumed were neutral. I hadn't touched him directly. I didn't need to. Access does the work when it's reclassified. At the hospital, administration paused negotiations with the medical network. Not canceled. Delayed. Compliance review. Routine language. The kind that sounds harmless until weeks start slipping. A compliance officer asked for documentation tied to emergency department integration. My name came up because I'd been the physician liaison in early drafts. I clarified that I was no longer associated with the legal contact handling the account. The update was logged. Clean. Unemotional. The investor noticed the shift. People like him always do. He called departments himself, bypassing assistants. He didn't get answers. He got process. Process doesn't bend to charm. It just repeats itself. My wife felt it that afternoon. Her calendar emptied faster than she could refill it. Meetings rescheduled without new dates. Calls returned by junior staff instead of executives. At a private clinic opening, she arrived alone, confident as ever, only to find her badge restricted to general access. No explanation. Just a polite apology and a printed wristband. She texted me then. Not angry. Careful. She asked if something had changed. I didn't respond. Silence has weight when it's unexpected. The investor still stood beside her publicly. Still smiled. But his posture shifted too. Less relaxed. He'd invested in proximity, and proximity was losing value. The network's attorneys began copying others on emails. Transparency crept in. The kind that kills informal influence. From my end, nothing looked dramatic. I worked my shifts. Slept during daylight. Ate standing up. The rental felt temporary, which was the point. I forwarded mail. Updated my address everywhere that mattered. The systems adapted quickly. They always do when you stop resisting. That evening, a mutual acquaintance mentioned my wife at the station. Said she seemed distracted. Said she asked whether I was okay. Not worried. Curious. I nodded and went back to cleaning equipment. Later, I saw her name disappear from a shared professional group chat I'd once been included in by default. No announcement. Just absence. Status evaporates quietly when it's no longer reinforced. The investor hosted a dinner that week. She attended. I didn't. She posted a photo that tried too hard to look unbothered. Comments were polite, not warm. Influence depends on momentum. Momentum had stalled. I didn't celebrate. I didn't monitor her closely. I just stayed out of reach. She had treated intimacy and access like earned privileges. I had simply updated the ledger. What followed wasn't punishment. It was gravity doing what it always does when support is removed. The social shift didn't announce itself. It revealed itself in corrections. In who stopped looping her in who suddenly needed things in writing. Influence fades when it has to explain itself. She showed up to a family dinner without me and tried to carry the space alone. I wasn't there to absorb the questions, to redirect attention. Someone asked how my schedule was. Someone else asked whether I'd switched hospitals. She answered carefully, professionally, like a deposition. No one pushed. They just adjusted. Conversations moved around her instead of toward her. At work, the change was sharper. A colleague she used to brief before meetings now briefed someone else. A junior associate double-checked her guidance in front of her. Not disrespectful. Cautious. The kind of caution that appears when backing has quietly disappeared. The investor still took her calls. But he stopped initiating. When he did speak, others were copied. Transparency isn't an insult. It's a boundary. She noticed. Her tone changed. Less assured. More precise. At a networking event tied to the medical network, she arrived early and left late. The kind of behavior people adopt when they're trying to reclaim something they didn't realize was conditional. She stood near decision-makers who used to approach her. Now they nodded and moved on. Not hostile. Neutral. I heard about it through channels that no longer belonged to us. A nurse mentioned she'd seen my wife at a panel discussion. Said she looked composed. Said she kept checking her phone. Said she left before the closing remarks. That night, she called again. Not frantic. Measured. She left a voicemail asking if we could talk logistics. Not feelings. Logistics are safe. I didn't return it. The investor hosted another private dinner. Fewer guests this time. She attended, but the seating had changed. She wasn't beside him. She was across the table, grouped with advisors. Still inside. Not central. People notice patterns even when they don't name them. They noticed I wasn't present. They noticed my name stopped being referenced as context. They noticed she stopped being treated as an extension of something stable. I watched from a distance I hadn't planned but didn't resist. Social structures depend on reinforcement. I had removed mine cleanly. No accusations. No scenes. Just absence where presence used to smooth things over. By the end of the week, she wasn't isolated because she'd been exposed. She was isolated because no one reached for her anymore. That kind of quiet doesn't feel like rejection at first. It feels like confusion. Then it settles into something heavier. Isolation doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in when routines lose their anchors. She felt it first in the mornings. No messages waiting. No confirmations. Just a calendar that looked full but behaved empty. She went to work earlier than usual, stayed later, filled the gaps with effort. Effort is visible when authority isn't. People thanked her more. They deferred less. She corrected a document in a meeting and someone asked her to send it for review instead of accepting it on the spot. Not an insult. A signal. At home, the house adjusted to one body. The lights stayed off. The thermostat followed a new pattern. Deliveries stopped coming under joint names. She noticed small things first. A pharmacy app logged her out. A streaming service asked her to create her own profile. Administrative, impersonal, relentless. She reached out to friends we used to see as a unit. They responded politely. Slowly. Invitations became conditional. Maybe next time. Let's see. No explanations. People follow stability. They don't chase uncertainty. She tried to anchor herself to the investor again. Showed up when she wasn't expected. Offered solutions before they were requested. He listened, but with distance. His assistant handled scheduling now. His replies came hours later, not minutes. Influence doesn't disappear. It reassigns. One evening, she went to a professional mixer alone. The kind of room that thrives on recognition. She stood near conversations that used to open for her. They didn't close. They just didn't widen. Someone asked how I was. Not to reconnect. To orient. She answered carefully. Too carefully. That night, she called and didn't leave a voicemail. The missed call notification sat on my screen while I ate standing at the counter of the rental. I didn't call back. Silence had already been established as the new medium. She posted less online. When she did, the engagement dipped. Not dramatically. Enough to notice. Status needs witnesses. Witnesses had drifted. I saw her once, by accident, near the hospital. She was sitting in her car, engine off, hands still on the wheel. She didn't see me. She stared ahead like she was waiting for instruction that wasn't coming. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance solidify. I had become something she couldn't reach through explanation or control. I was no longer reacting. I was no longer present. Isolation doesn't mean being alone. It means discovering which connections were conditional. She was learning that now, one quiet correction at a time, while I remained exactly where I was supposed to be. Out of reach, but undeniably real. She finally asked to meet when logistics stopped working without a human voice. The message wasn't emotional. It was structured. Time. Place. Neutral ground. A coffee shop near the courthouse where people speak carefully by habit. I didn't reply. I showed up. She arrived early. Sat straight. Phone face down. She had chosen a table with her back to the wall, a lawyer's instinct. When she saw me, her expression adjusted in stages. Relief first. Then calculation. Then something she didn't let finish forming. She spoke in controlled segments. She said she didn't understand what had happened. She said there must have been a miscommunication. She said my absence had caused complications she hadn't anticipated. She didn't say she missed me. She said the situation was inefficient. I listened without interrupting. The barista called names. Cups were set down. Life moved around us. She asked if we could reset certain access points. Accounts. Coverage. Schedules. She framed it as temporary. Practical. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't accuse. I told her the changes were intentional and already finalized. I said the paperwork was filed. I said communication would go through counsel from now on. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She paused then, long enough for the silence to become visible. She asked if this was about the investor. Not his name. His role. She said everything had been professional. She said proximity didn't mean betrayal. She said touch was earned, not owed. She repeated it like a principle. I looked at her the way you look at a patient who's confusing pain tolerance with immunity. I didn't challenge the sentence. I accepted it. I said access worked the same way. That was when her control slipped. Not dramatically. Her breathing changed. She asked what I wanted. The question was reflexive. Power always asks it eventually. I told her nothing. I said I was done participating in systems that required me to negotiate my presence. I stood up before she could respond. I left my coffee untouched. I didn't look back. Outside, she followed me to the door. She said my name once. Not loud. Not pleading. Testing whether it still worked. It didn't. I walked away knowing the confrontation wasn't the end. It was the confirmation. I wasn't disappearing to make a point. I was gone because the structure no longer included me. And once someone steps out of the frame entirely, there's nothing left to argue with. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in fragments she couldn't control or reframe. The first was professional. The medical network announced a restructuring, the kind that sounds strategic but cuts in formal influence cleanly. Her role shifted from lead contact to advisory support. Same title, less reach. People stopped asking for her opinion before decisions were made. The investor didn't disappear. He adjusted. Publicly, he remained courteous. Privately, his attention moved on. New consultants. New faces. He had never promised loyalty. Only access. And access had become inconvenient. She tried to stabilize what was left. Took extra meetings. Reached out to contacts who used to return calls immediately. Responses came slower, or not at all. The silence wasn't hostile. It was indifferent. Indifference is harder to fight because it doesn't react. Socially, the shift was sharper. Invitations stopped arriving automatically. When she did attend events, she was introduced without context. Just her name. No association. No implied backing. People listened politely and then turned away. Status depends on reference points. Mine had been removed. At home, the reality set in through logistics. The divorce paperwork arrived with timestamps she couldn't dispute. The insurance notices followed. Coverage updated. Address changed. She read the documents the way lawyers do, scanning for leverage that wasn't there. She reached out again, not to negotiate, but to orient herself. She asked if I was seeing someone. Not jealousy. Calibration. I didn't answer. My life no longer provided reference points for hers. I heard about her through others. That she'd taken time off. That she'd been seen alone more often. That she'd lost weight she didn't need to lose. That she asked about me in ways that sounded delayed, like she was catching up to something already concluded. The investor's name stopped coming up in conversations connected to her. His presence had moved elsewhere. Influence, once broken, doesn't linger. It relocates. I saw her one last time from a distance, at a charity event tied to the hospital. She stood near the entrance, scanning the room like she was looking for an anchor. People passed. Conversations formed and dissolved around her. She remained still. I didn't approach. I didn't need to. The collapse wasn't about loss. It was about recognition arriving too late to matter. She was learning that systems don't grieve. They simply reconfigure. And she was no longer at the center of any of them. The end didn't come with a conversation. It arrived through confirmation. Final documents filed. Accounts settled. Names separated cleanly enough that systems stopped linking us automatically. The kind of ending that doesn't ask how you feel about it. I moved into a place closer to the hospital. Smaller. Quieter. Everything in it had a reason to be there. I worked more shifts, not to escape, but because the work required presence. People came in broken and left stabilized or didn't leave at all. The rules were clear. Outcomes weren't negotiated. She tried once more, weeks later. Not directly. Through counsel. A request to revisit certain terms. Framed as fairness. I agreed to nothing beyond what was already written. The response was brief. Administrative. Closed. I heard she'd changed firms. Not upward. Lateral. A reset disguised as opportunity. She attended fewer events. Chose smaller rooms. Adjusted her expectations downward without ever saying it out loud. The investor's network expanded without her name attached. His influence continued. Hers recalibrated. One afternoon, I ran into someone who used to know us as a unit. They asked how I was doing. Not politely. Specifically, I said I was fine. It wasn't a performance. It was a fact. I never saw her again. Not in person, not across a room. The city is large when paths stop intersecting. Occasionally, her name surfaced in contexts that no longer required a response from me. Eventually, it stopped surfacing at all. She had believed closeness was something to be rationed. That access created value. She wasn't wrong. She just misjudged who controlled the gates. I didn't disappear to punish her. I disappeared because staying required permission I no longer needed. I took back everything she assumed was permanent, not as revenge, as correction. People ask sometimes why I never fought, why I never demanded explanations. I don't answer. The absence does the explaining. What remains isn't bitterness. It's clarity. I show up where I'm respected. I leave where I'm managed. Touch, time, presence, access. None of it is owed. All of it is chosen. And once I stopped choosing her, the story ended exactly where it should have. Not loudly, not publicly, just conclusively. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.